The article that I chose, I heard that The Sociolinguist Reality of the Black Feminist Afrofuture by Stephanie Jones is an article about Black speculative fiction. So, speculative fiction, or a type of science fiction written by Black authors as a way of reflecting and celebrating Black culture. A term that's used a lot throughout is Black sociolinguist reality, which was described by Jones as a charting method that recognizes Black language practices as processes of invention unique to Black linguistics that constructs the multitudinous nature of Blackness in the future. So, with a Black sociolinguist reality, they are using language as a tool for liberation. They are creating their own language outside of the constraints of white culture, and they're using it in the fiction that they're creating. Geneva Smitherman is cited in this article as saying, "Reality is not merely socially, but sociolinguistically constructed. Real-world experience and phenomena do not exist in some raw, undifferentiated form. Rather, reality is always filtered, apprehended, encoded, codified, and conveyed via some linguistic shape." So, basically, what Smitherman is saying is that language reflects reality, and in that way, it can also create reality. Language is so ingrained into our culture that it is one of the most important things that we use, if not the most important thing that we use. And so she's saying that Black language is central to Black culture, and by using that language in this fiction, they are creating what Mark Derry calls Afrofuturism. Now, Jones recognizes that this is not the best description, which makes sense because he's a white guy trying to coin terms about the work of people of color. Historically, it does not seem very good. But he describes it as a type of speculative fiction that places Black, historical Black concerns in modern culture with technology, and he describes it as appropriating images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future, and putting it in the context of Black culture. But Afrofuturism harnesses and reflects Black culture. It allows Black feminists to consider the questions what if only, and if this goes on, which are central questions in the genre of science fiction in general. Jones argues that people arguing that the future is race-free undermines the efforts and cultures of people of color and completely dismisses the impact that these cultures have on these people and their experiences in the world. And Afrofuturism allows Black writers to tell their own stories outside of the history of slavery and other traumas that Black people have endured, especially in America. And instead, it takes the history and creates something new out of it. She says, Black women writing speculative fiction demand we remember through emergence of forgotten history and the strategy of writing themselves into the stories of the past in order to write themselves alive in the present. I see speculative fiction as an African-American intersectional practice that rhetorically imbues the history and language of Black feminist thought into public discourse, so that readers may come to recognize and remember African-American history as integral to stories that imagine the future. Black women writing speculative fiction helps us understand that without Afrofuturist feminism, there is no future. And so in this, she's saying that Afrofuturism is really based off of Black women's discourse and ideas that are completely centered around Black women's interactions with each other and with the world. She brings up the fact that Black women's storytelling is immensely important and so central in so many cultures, regardless of specific country or even specific culture, and Afrofuturist feminism is an extension of that. They bring feminist and racially conscious ideals to Black characters, and they subvert the stereotypes created by white writers by creating rich world-building and well-rounded Black characters, which combats the racist ideology that's woven into so much of existing science fiction. That Black women are constantly having to contextualize the past in order to see how they fit into modern culture, but with the constraints of white supremacy and all of these racist ideologies that are being pushed by white writers especially, they're constantly having to find new ways to create fiction, new ways to fit into the dominant culture in a way that doesn't really fit in at all, in a way that creates their own space and uses their own representation. And representation is incredibly important, even in white frame stories, because white people tend to forget people of culture in their science fiction stories, which automatically cultivates racism. Fiction can influence reality, especially when it comes to familiarity with and acceptance of people that are unlike us. And representation offers hope to those people for recognition of their worth and intelligence without the loss of their language and their culture. Jones uses examples from Star Trek, specifically Nichelle Nichols, who, in her characterization, portrays human emotions like fear and love through using Swahili. And so in that, she demonstrates the power of Black language and allows Black viewers to see themselves on screen without losing their language and losing their ways of moving through the world, but instead just fitting that into this new story. And she also talks about Michael Burnham in a newer edition of Star Trek. And she talks about how Michael Burnham's character is pursuing social justice, and she is making change by being human. She doesn't sacrifice herself for others, but instead she accepts herself and embraces her other cultures because she is Vulcan and human, which can offer representation for people who are mixed race or grew up with multiple cultures as well. She talks about the author Octavia Butler, and Octavia Butler spoke about Star Wars and about how people weren't including non-white people in their science fiction stories. And she said, "Back when Star Wars was new, a familiar excuse for ignoring minorities went something like this. Science fiction is escapist literature. Its readers/viewers don't want to be weighted down with real problems. War? Okay. Planet-wide destruction? Okay. Kidnapping? Okay. But the sight of a minority person? Too heavy. Too real." And, of course, there again is the implication that a sprinkling of blacks, Asians, or others could turn the story into some sort of racial statement. The only statement I could imagine being made by such a sprinkling would be that among the white human people, the tall furry people, the lumpy scaly people, the tentacled people, etc., were also brown human people, black human people, etc. This isn't a heavy statement, unless it's missing. Go away.
My face is like...
Go away. Alright, moving on. And so Butler's point about representation in science fiction is that by not including these people, it is perpetuating the idea that they don't belong in imaginings of the future, and that is very problematic. Jones talks about Octavia Butler's story Kindred, which really puts black cultures and black futures at the forefront. The main character can travel across time and space, and Jones says, "Still her voice, the only tool she can rely on to get here through this dangerous situation, is also the thing that can get her killed." That sounds very familiar about black women using their voices for rhetoric and making change. They are using their voices to create that change and to find their way in this structure that is entirely built against them, and that is also what makes it so dangerous, because they are deviating from the dominant culture. Jones also talks about how Afrofuturist works have different emphases than white speculative fiction. One of the emphases is the importance of time. She talks about how time has been a tool in white supremacy and the oppression that black people face, because it doesn't allow black people to define their own future, to write their own futures, to experience their own futures, because everything is in a white context. And so that places the emphasis on history rather than time itself, or even on future, because Afrofuturist works place history at the forefront and culture at the forefront rather than just where technology is going, which is more prevalent in white speculative fiction. She also talks about how Afrofuturist works tend to divert from the path of the white-centered hero's journey and other narrative structures that are built around whiteness, because white supremacist tropes are in these narratives so often. The idea that there is a manifest destiny or this divine right that allows the main character to push through and be the hero, which she brings up the point that we see that in Star Wars, where you learn that the only way to be a Jedi is through lineage, through being born into it. And so it reinforces this idea that there is a God-given, correct way to be a hero, and that upholds white supremacy. She says, the mythology is coded so that only particular individuals can achieve greatness or save their people, and since the mythology is shared, it does not really leave any room to explore if anyone else's lives matter. And that is exactly what Afrofuturist works try to deviate from and shift the focus so that the focus is on the culture and these people that would not be heroes in white supremacist works that are so prevalent in our society. Reading this article, I was thinking a lot about my feminist theater class that I'm taking currently, and how we've been talking about how language can be a very important colonizing tool, but it can also be used to reclaim identities. And one of the articles cited in Jones's work, and also we talked about it in feminist theater, was the Combahee River Collective in 1986, talking about how being free means that you need to dismantle all systems of oppression. And Jones talks about this in the context of dismantling these systems of oppression so that you can write a future that allows people to be free. Whereas in feminist theater, we were talking about it in the context of our everyday society. We have been talking about how language really affects people and how colonizers use language to constrain people and put them in these little boxes and don't allow for any deviation, and that's exactly what white speculative fiction does a lot of the time. And when talking about kindred, Jones said, black bodies are always already political objects because of our ties to labor as the means and mode of production in America. And this immediately made me think of semiotics, which we talk about in feminist theater, but we also talk about in linguistics. Semiotics is the idea that there is a sign system to literally everything around us. And so in feminist theater, we talk about the sign system for women. And how, for example, looking at a picture of Marilyn Monroe really is making you think about whiteness, about thinness, about the beauty standards that have been set by white people in America. Rather than just thinking about this woman who was an actress, there are so many other ideas connected to it. And Jones's point is that that sign system exists for black bodies as well, because they always exist in these structures of oppression, in these structures of white supremacy and white dominance in our culture. And so in that way, they can't be thought of as separate unless you make the choice to dismantle those systems of oppression, especially in fiction. When you're trying to write black characters who are really, truly free, you need to take out those systems of oppression entirely. I was also thinking about the comparisons between Butler and the Grimke works. They were both taking what people think and subverting it within their genres, forcing them to recognize their own hypocrisy and bringing in personal accounts. And Jones also was bringing in personal accounts, talking about how the first time she experienced racism through language, she didn't know what she meant. She thought it was a good thing until her father explained it to her, and then she knew it was a bad thing. But the issue was that she blamed herself. And so using that personal account, she is contextualizing these Afrofuturist ideas that she's been talking about in speculative fiction, and she puts it into the world that we live in now. Grimke argues that it was a human right to advocate for yourself, so women should be able to. She also argues that there should be no difference between men and women in intelligence and ability, which aligns with her Quaker ideals. And in arguing that rhetoric is a human power and everyone has the right to do it, they speak out against misogyny and racism. They say that everyone has a right to control their own lives and speak out against what affects them. Butler also uses rhetoric in that human power to speak out against misogyny and racism in the context of Afrofuturist works. And the other authors referenced in this article do that as well. I was also comparing it to Sojourner Truth because Afrofuturism emphasizes the vast differences between black experiences and white experiences, and they also both use personal accounts. Sojourner Truth uses examples such as not being held from carriages and her own impressive strength to argue that because she does not look like a standard woman in society, so to speak, she doesn't get treated like one. And black women are creating their own sociolinguistic reality through Afrofuturism because they are not treated like real people, whereas white women are. Eloquence doesn't really come into play in this context, but respectability does when thinking about what the method is changing. By restructuring this genre to include other cultures and frame them in a way that's not just normalized but celebrated, it builds the respect and sense of community that we have for each other, both within those cultures and between other ones. In fact, it doesn't really fit the traditional rhetorics of respectability at all because they're not trying to make themselves palatable, but instead are constructing their own worlds that are meant to be centered around people like them and dismantle these systems of oppression in order to create their own thing. And this is a more creative way to distribute power, which, as we know, is a function of rhetoric. And the Grimkes and Truth and Butler and Jones are all using the same functions of building community, distributing power, and assisting advocacy. Traditionally, black Americans have used rhetoric as a means of public action, and women have used it to push against societal norms in the 19th century. Afrofuturism does both of these things. It is a call to action to dismantle these systems of oppression and also take a stand in everyday life to contextualize things within black culture rather than just the white one that we're presented with all the time. And it also pushes against societal norms by breaking away from the white supremacist tropes and traditionally white narratives and narrative structures that we see in fiction. Now that it's expanding to fiction and it's not limited to mostly just speeches as it was more common to do in the 19th century, and with more mediums, people can get much more creative with how they get active in their communities and create change. This seems like a natural segue in a comparison because in the 19th century, the literacy rates were rising, especially in women, because of the rise of standardized education. And so it makes a lot of sense that this would be expanding to written works and to creative works as well. And they all have a focus on empowering and inspiring others to take action. This article really changed the way that I think about science fiction and speculative fiction. I read a lot of it. It's one of my favorite genres to read. I took a science fiction literature class in high school. Shout out Mr. Hepworth. And I had never really thought about how speculative fiction could utilize the past to contextualize the present and build the future when marginalized groups use it as a tool. I had definitely seen that practice, but I had never really thought of it in much detail, especially in the context of Afrofuturism. But it's really interesting, and it really can make connections with queer people, with women, and other people of color's writings as well, in using the past to dismantle systems of oppression and create a future that actually allows for cultural celebration. And I'm gonna look for these elements of the past and how they affect the future and present of the stories now. On a more basic level, I'm going to look into more speculative fiction by black authors that utilize this strategy because this seems really interesting, especially Butler's works. They seem really interesting, and I'm really interested to see what this method looks like in action when I'm actually looking for it. It also really inspired me to think about how black women are portrayed in science fiction and media more. The Star Trek examples were ones I was very familiar with. I grew up watching the show, but I had never really thought about it in that way, which makes sense why I didn't see those connections. But I really like seeing that nuance and understanding it as much as I can, and I just think that's fascinating that Nichelle Nichols was using language in that way, and that really connected people and made them feel like their culture was being seen on screen in a way that wasn't just passing. It wasn't just passing through the story. And I thought that was really interesting. I had seen examples of minorities using their fiction writing to encourage change and healing in their communities, but I'd never seen it dissected like this in this specific way, and it was really interesting to read Jones's work. It's definitely something I'm going to look for in the future, and obviously I'm not going to be utilizing Afrofuturism specifically, but I might look into utilizing pieces of history when I write in order to construct meaningful and empowering stories. I actually write speculative fiction pretty often. It's a genre that I really enjoy reading and writing, and I think this is a really interesting way to go about it by using the past with the future and not really what's in the middle. I think it's a really interesting tactic, and I think it's really fascinating how that can really make a difference in how stories are read and how stories are analyzed and how they affect people.